the third Virtual My Jericho of what might be a very long series. Last week we had Is the BBC in Peril? The week before, the chairwoman of the Environment Committee of the County Council. And this week, Professor Gary Browning, who's a professor of politics at Oxford Brookes, who's actually not really going to talk about politics. He's going to talk about Iris Murdoch and her life and thought. Iris Murdoch, as some people know, was a novelist, a philosopher, and much more. Now, so far, unfortunately, we've not been able to get a picture from him. We do have his sound. So what we'll do is we'll listen to him carefully, then I'll ask some questions and I'll ask some of yours. Gary, over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, John, and thanks very much for inviting me to kind of to talk here. And it's on a subject that I'm really interested in, and I think is very interesting. It's Iris Murdoch. What I think is particularly special about her is that she was she was someone who was very adept in a number of spheres. She had a lot of interests, and she had a tremendous expertise in different kind of areas of life and areas of disciplines of activity. In 1947, she wrote a letter, and she wrote letters throughout her life, but in 1947, she wrote a letter to her friend Raymond Queneau, the French novelist, and she said, "Can I really exploit the advantages instead of, as hitherto, suffering the disadvantages of having a mind bordering on philosophy, literature, and politics?" Now, my reading of Murdoch is that she could deliver on that combination of philosophy, literature, and politics in her life. And that's what makes her so special, I think, is that she's got these areas of interest which are diverse. There is a kind of debate about whether her philosophy and her literature are connected. I think they are connected, and they're not the same thing. She's doing different things in her novels from what she does in her philosophy, but it's my reading of her thought that they are connected. But she has this very full and incredibly vibrant life, I think. Throughout her life, she knows lots and lots of people. She gains a lot by kind of emotional interaction with lots of people. And she thinks hard philosophically, and she's kind of critical of some standard positions at the time in philosophy. And she tries to combine continental and Anglo-American philosophy, virtually alone in the UK at the time. And she writes some very, very exciting, interesting, and fun and absorbing novels. So I think she's someone who's terrific to get engaged with. And I've enjoyed that over the last, 30 years. And I wrote a book not long ago called Why Iris Murdoch Matters. And everyone can buy this from wherever. It's with Bloomsbury.
How much and who's the publisher?
Sorry?
How much and who is the publisher?
I think it's certainly under 20 quid. And it's Bloomsbury publisher. You can, Amazon or one of those others will kind of get it to you fairly quickly. She was born in Dublin, in North Dublin, her father was a minor civil servant. And they moved to London pretty quickly. She was educated at a progressive private school, badminton school in Bristol, which had interest in things like the League of Nations. And she took up progressive political causes, even while she was a school student. She then went to Oxford, and I've been walking around Oxford this week in my exercise sessions, and she went to Somerville, and she had quite an impact there. She was friends with a number of thinkers, women who would subsequently become important thinkers, like Philippa Foot and Mary Midgley and Elizabeth Anscombe. And she also had lots of affairs, lots of relationships with people, and she studied philosophy and was a real person. A celebrity, really, undergraduate. And she, after her undergraduate career, she went to Cambridge to study philosophy, which was in the wake of Wittgenstein. She met Wittgenstein once, but also connected very closely with with people who were studying Wittgenstein, and she was developing a very, very absorbed interest in philosophy. Her journals at the time are teeming with lots of thoughts on philosophy. She reads lots of people. She reads Hegel. She reads Wittgenstein. She engages with students of Wittgenstein. She's very excited during the war in reading Sartre and other existentialists. The war obviously had a big effect. It disrupted university life. She went to be a civil servant in London, and actually did a bit of spying, actually, because she was a member of the Communist Party at the time. She also, at the end of the war, got involved with UNRWA, which was the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And she saw at first hand the effects of the war on refugees, and that had a massive influence on her life, on the rest of her life. I think every novel has a kind of refugee or a migrant in it. And then after that, she got a position at St. Anne's College in philosophy. And she worked very hard in thinking through philosophy. And she developed a philosophy which was critical of both continental and Anglo-American strands at the time. She was very conscious that she was living in an age of change. It was a modern age in which some of the myths of God, of religion, of objectivist morality, of the great political ideologies were being challenged under a kind of modernist emphasis upon subjectivity, individuality, choice. Lots of the old ways were ending. And she was critical of moral philosophy at the time, which tended to emphasize choice and to play down the prospects of a objective vision of how morality should be. And she wanted to revive a kind of Platonism in which the good was thought to matter a lot to our lives, and it wasn't just subjective choice. And she wrote a number of essays, some of which were collected together in 1970 in The Sovereignty of Good. And in those papers, she talks about perfection, but it's not an abstract perfection. It's a way of attending to others. She thinks morality is about getting outside the ego, the self, and moving away from the subjectivism and the emphasis upon choice in liberal politics, liberal morality, and even in existentialist thought, which emphasized choice of the self. She thought what we should do is try and get away from the ego and attend to others and strive for perfection, which is probably never, ever realizable. She gives the example of the mother and a future daughter-in-law, where the mother of her, she's got a loving child. This is in the idea of perfection, where the mother feels really kind of quite upset that her lovely son, her beloved son, is married someone that she thinks is rather loud and vulgar. But the mother reflects a bit more on whether she's seeing, whether she's attending to this other person justly and lovingly. And she ends up thinking that she's got a kind of openness, a brightness, and that she had misperceived her. So the answer there is that I think for Murdoch, we don't just accept subjective choice. We try to attend more closely to the circumstances and to other people. Now, although I think she also was writing novels from 1954, she published Under the Net, and she then wrote 26 novels. Now, these novels don't set out a set of philosophical doctrines, because she finds that, she doesn't think philosophy is about doctrines, but her philosophy points to important things like attending to people. And what I think she does in her novels is to show us people grappling with the modern world, engaging in kind of moral dilemmas and political kind of situations and love affairs, it has to be said. And in all of this, we see people who, for the most part, find life difficult. They difficult to get away from the ego. And there are really a whole series of novels where we see people like, I guess, in The Sea, a famous novel for which she got the Booker Prize. The hero, the kind of protagonist, Charles Araby, tries to get away from his past life, where he's been a very successful theatre director, and he says he wants to be good, but he's brought himself with him. And whenever he meets people, a past lover and people he's been involved with, his ego causes problems, and he can't really be the good person that he's trying to be, because he doesn't really look at other people. He doesn't really see them. So Murdoch developed this sense of moral philosophy as being something which was not coming out with a formula of subjectivism or like utility, where you keep people's preferences the same, but you just try to maximize for the general number. She wanted us to really kind of look at other people and to have a vision, and a kind of revised vision, a critical vision of how things were. And as I said, as she went on in developing her thought in her philosophy, she attended closely to what she thought was the processes of demythologization which were happening, that belief in God had declined, and lots of the kind of supports for, say, a moral life, a just life, were diminishing. And metaphysics had kind of declined, in that philosophers like others were saying we should base all of our thinking on kind of what can be verified through our senses and so on. But she thought that metaphysics was still viable in kind of connecting area of thought and seeing connections and seeing the value of activities like art and indeed religion, without its kind of reliance on supersensory miracles and so on. So her book towards the end of her life on metaphysics as a guide to morals is this emphatic endorsement of philosophy and metaphysics and how it can contribute to morality. And she kept on also writing novels through her career. She did have a kind of very involved life, and she had a number of lovers. She had lots and lots of relationships, friends, and so on. But I guess she got some order in her life when she married John Bailey in 1956, an English Don who was someone who kind of got on with her. They got on as a couple. And although she continued to have lots of relations with other peoples, he gave her some kind of security and safety where she could develop some of her thinking and also continue to write these wonderful novels. There are 26 of them, and I think they're all worth reading. Towards the end, they get longer and longer, and probably more kind of more difficult to read in some sense, because she also felt that the truth wasn't ever going to come through one ego, and she wanted to frame novels where there were multiple dimensions, multiple characters, and that the author didn't simply give some kind of view of the world herself. It was something that these novels should be open, should be inclusive and varied. And so I think she tried to do that throughout her life. But towards the end, the novels got very long. And of course, she's been looked at in many ways. One was as an adoring couple. There was the film Iris, which celebrated her, and then also saw her as somewhat abject at the end of her life because she suffered from Alzheimer's for the last 2 or 3 years before she died in 1999. And then there was a reaction. Her life was seen as actually full of also affairs and so on. So what got lost there, I think, a bit, was the fact that her life was also and preeminently devoted to thought and writing. And if you read the journals, there is lots of mention of relationships with people, but there is also, and preeminently, I think, lots of thought about philosophy, some thought about politics, and lots of thought about lots of things. So she is a kind of very important writer, I think. The novels are very good because they are fun, lively, as well as thoughtful. And they do show us something about how difficult it is to really attend to other people. And her philosophy has that measure as well. So, and I would say that politics is important for her. She starts off massively on the left. She's a member of the Communist Party. And she attends a meeting connected with the 1938 by-election in Oxford, the appeasement by-election, when there was an opposition to the government, and over 1,000 people were in Hyde Bridge Street, where the Communist Party was. And she, and that's interesting. And she stayed on the left for a number of years, and throughout her career, she was very concerned with migrants, refugees, and so on, which has a relevance to today. So I think I've said something about her life, something about her thought, her philosophy, and something about her novels. And I think her greatness is that she manages to run with all of those and keep them together.
Let me ask you a few questions if I can, Gary. Was she a better novelist than a philosopher, or a better philosopher than a novelist?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, it is interesting, her life, because I guess she starts off being most highly regarded as a philosopher. You know, she makes her way at St. Anne's College. She writes some interesting essays. But then when she begins to write as a novelist, she gets published, first of all, in 1954. She'd had a couple of goes at writing novels before that. She becomes really more famous and celebrated as a novelist. And she then writes a series of novels which win awards. You know, The Sea gets the Booker Prize, The Sea in the 1970s. But then I think her novels have gone out of fashion. And now her philosophy, I think, is becoming more in fashion. There's lots of people who are somewhat critical, say, of some of the standard work in British analytic, UK and American analytic philosophy. And some of her criticisms are regarded well. And she is thought to be an interesting philosopher. And she's gaining, again, I think her reputation is gaining. I myself, what I most like about her is that she combines the two. I do find her philosophy interesting and thoughtful, and I find her novels, some of her novels especially, excellent and very readable. But I like the combination. Okay.
Which is her best book and why?
Yeah, I mean, it's always tricky to say what someone's best book is. I mean, say if you're reading a novel, I mean, most people I think would go for either The Bell, which was in 58, and a really kind of interesting novel, really good kind of form, where there is a spiritual lay community trying to orient themselves towards the good and failing, and is all set within this kind of community next to an abbey in Gloucestershire, and it's very atmospheric. There's a great sense of place, and there's a very good central character, Michael Meade, who's trying to be good, this guy, but he's a homosexual when that was outlawed, and he finds life very, very difficult. And in the end, he's a bit of a failure. As I said, The Sea is also people would look to, and I think that's very good. But the one I would pick is a novel, again, because I think novels are probably more easily readable straight off, would be The Flight from the Enchanter, which is her second novel. And I like that because there's so much going on. Nearly every character in it is a migrant or has something to do with migrants. She was interested in the idea of kind of figures who are highly charismatic, power-driven, and dangerous. And in that novel, there is a kind of newspaper proprietor who is a migrant himself, Misha Fox, and he's dangerous. He kind of allures and draws people to him and controls them. And I guess The Flight from the Enchanter is about fleeing from him. But then there are other migrants there. Rosa Keep, who's trying to keep away from this Misha Fox, is someone who also, because of her kind of social conscience, works in a factory for a while, like one of Iris Murdoch's great mentors, Simone Weil. She works in a factory and she comes across two migrants, two Polish characters, two Polish workers who come over. And she befriends them and teaches them, but then they have sex with her and they try to dominate her and she's in a mess. And she calls upon the help of Mr. Fox, who uses his political connections to put pressure on migrants. And then in the kind of wake of that, this rather innocent woman, Nina, again from Middle Europe, a migrant who suffered in the war, she is very, very worried about what's going on in the aftermath of this. And Rosa Keep is a friend or someone she knows, but Rosa does not attend to Nina at this time. And there are problems because of that. And that illustrates, I think, Murdoch's great value she placed upon attention, both in her philosophy and in her novels, that we should attend to other people. And there are lots of side plots to this novel in that there's a kind of bureaucratic organization dealing with migrants, which is pretty inefficient, ineffective, and the men at the top are pretty useless. And the women who work as secretaries or low-grade administrators actually run the place. And that's a bit comic and also quite telling, because Murdoch has some sympathy for women, is aware of how women are treated and tend to be kind of dominated. But some feminists might think she could have said more directly to speak up for feminism, but in this novel, there is some awareness and kind of showing you the domination of men over women. But it's a great novel because it brings together politics, affairs, the social world, economics, in that the power of Mr. Fox is very important. So it's a very powerful novel.
Now, you mentioned Simone Weil there. I am afraid I'm a world expert on her because I made a Channel 4 film about her. Now, she starved herself to death because she miscalculated what somebody in occupied France was eating. So not one to follow. And her other great hero was Karl Marx, who virtually starved his family to death. Are those two good role models for her, do you think?
Well, it all depends what a role model is, you know. I think she definitely takes things from Simone Weil. I mean, Simone Weil does kind of, it was a very unfortunate end to her life. Simone Weil was pretty driven, pretty committed politically. She was pretty driven and committed, as I understand it, in terms of her thinking as well and her religiosity. And she actually argued very strongly with a religious inflection that attention is very important to others and that the ego is a massive problem. And and she talked about unselfing. But that was within a very possibly dangerous kind of self-abnegation mode. But her highlighting of the importance of taking others seriously, of attending to others, and of trying to get away from the ego definitely influenced Iris Murdoch. And although one wouldn't want to replicate all aspects of Simone Weil's life, or for that matter, Iris Murdoch's life, I think it's interesting that she drew upon this important kind of European thinker. On Marx, well, lots of people were drawn to Marx, and there are pros and cons of Marx, but one of the great things about Marx, I suppose, is that he is a social thinker who sees the importance of social role, social class, and recognizes the importance of capital and of the increasing kind of movement of capital and the drawing of all individuals within that. And Murdoch drew upon Marx, but then she did move away from Marxism, and she moved away partly because of her contacts with Europeans who suffered under Marxism in Eastern Europe. And she continued to work for a number of kind of migrants from Eastern Europe. You know, she was, by the end, she was against utopianism in politics.
They were both communists who became Catholics, both Simone Weil and her. Is there a lesson in that?
Well, I mean, Iris Murdoch didn't become a Catholic.
Spiritual, should we say?
Well, she became spiritual, certainly. Well, I think you could argue that life has many dimensions. Well, one should argue that life has many dimensions to it. There is a spiritual dimension, and there is a political dimension. There is an economic dimension, and it's up to all of us, I think, to try to measure up to those different elements. And I think Murdoch made an attempt to measure up to all of those elements. So, and I think her kind of move, which to increasingly maybe highlight the spiritual, is not a bad move. It's kind of, but it was a spiritual without believing in miraculous supersensory activities.
But were they both looking for gods, and did their god fail?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on Vale, but I get the sense that she was looking for God, but found it difficult. Murdoch thought that this problem of the crashing of all of our myths is that it's no longer possible to believe in a personal God. It's no longer possible to believe, say, that Christ rose from the dead. That is, and lots of the kind of spiritual people, religious people in her novels subscribe to the death of God kind of view. But she thought there was something in religion, this sense of that we can see unities in life, we can see goodness, and religion can pick up on that. And that is something worth attending to. But she stayed true to the view that we shouldn't or can't really accept dogmatic religious pronouncements as truths.
Now, she is what our current MP would call pansexual. She had love affairs with both men and women. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think this is, I said earlier that her novels have gone out of fashion. I think one way that they might come back into fashion is that they do show from an early time, you know, like the Bell has got this homosexual who finds himself in a real mess because his sexual kind of character cannot be realized in the present society. And he reflects, is it possible to think of a society in the future where homosexuality will be accepted? And so Murdoch, and that was in 58, the Bell, that's long before homosexuality was legalized. And I think most of her novels after that time have at least one homosexual in it. And interestingly, in some of the later novels, like A Fairly Honourable Defeat, in the later 60s, there is a homosexual couple who are in it, and they are not, I mean, they do okay, and it's not a feature of the plot that their homosexuality is taken to be massively unusual. So they are, or freaky or whatever, you know, it's part of the fabric of life. And she herself, yes, was, she thought, she wrote a paper justifying the legalization of homosexuality and thought, there's really no argument here because we should accept people's sexual preferences. And she found herself having a kind of sexuality which was oriented to men and women. Yeah, and she did have affairs with women as well as with men. And she thought there was no reason why we should limit and repress sexual activity. And I think that has been vindicated, and that's an area where she contributed to the political kind of culture of the time, I think, in writing quite powerful novels.
Well, her husband, John Bailey, had the patience of Job, didn't he? I mean, to live with her, and also through her dementia as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he was aware of her proclivities from the outset, and he lived with him, and I think it did not, or they felt that it did not impair their relationship. So he did live with it, yes. And he did kind of look after her while she had dementia at the end, which again, is good. I mean, Murdoch's mother had dementia as well, and Murdoch cared for her, and so and she was quite sensitive to her mother's dementia, recognizing its awfulness and attending to her. And similarly, Bailey in the end was kind of sensitive to her.
They lived in North Oxford, didn't they? And then in Steeple Aston. Was she well known in both areas?
Yeah. Well, she as a student, she lived all over and Jericho, actually, North Oxford, Southmore Road. She had friends in Walton Street. She lived in Beaumont Street for a while. And Parktown. She lived in various places in Parktown. They got married, and she married in 1956. And fairly soon after that, they moved to Steeple Aston, and they got a big house there, which they enjoyed living in. The big house was quite difficult because neither of them were very practical. And so they kind of lived in rooms and didn't really put much care into the upkeep of the place. So there were leaks and newspapers strewn all over the place. At some point, it all got a bit too much for them. And so they moved to North Oxford and Hamilton Road. And then they moved to Charlbury Road. And again, they didn't attend much to the upkeep of the place. So there were leaks all over the place, books everywhere. It was a real mess. Actually, interestingly, in a fairly honourable defeat, one of the few characters in her novels who comes out as incredibly good is Tallis Brown, and he's juxtaposed to an evil character. And one of his characteristics is he lives in a mess, and so they did for their lives, yeah. But they were characters on the scene. They knew lots of people, and they knew lots of people in Oxford and London.
Yes, and she had a brilliant mind. So what effect did Alzheimer's have on her and on her mind?
Well, she had Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed with it in 1997, and she died in 1999. And it had a pretty awful effect. She was reduced. And, some people, Bailey, she wrote a novel actually in 1995, Jackson's Dilemma, which some people kind of say shows signs of the impairment that she had. And I think there have been some studies which show that it has a much less vocabulary than earlier novels. I mean, maybe it's me, but I quite like the novel. I think at one point, some people leave for Canada and then they come back from New Zealand. So she doesn't kind of standardize what's going on. But but that novel shows someone who was still kind of had something to say and wrote well. But the last 2 or 3 years of her life were difficult. And of course, John Bailey wrote his memoir before she died. And some people, A.M. Wilson in particular, thinks that he maybe exploited her abjectness in that he had some launch party in Blackwell's and Iris was brought in and couldn't really communicate much to anyone. But I think he did care for her and she did feel safe. And that was good for those last 2 or 3 years of her life.
You obviously never met her, but if you met her, what question would you ask her?
Well, I think she was pretty up for it when she met people. I mean, the people I know would say that they didn't know her very well, and the first question she'd ask them is, "What do you believe in? Do you believe in God? Do you believe in what religion do you have? Or what's your politics? Where are your politics?" So maybe I would reflect back and say to her, "Hey, what are your politics now?" At some point, or just exactly what do you believe in religion? I think I'd probably try and go for the throat, so to speak, because I think she respected that. She was a very engaging character. She wrote lots of letters, and she obviously mattered. If you read her letters to those people, they mattered to her. And so she had lots of very important relationships. So I'm sure she would have been a very good person to know.
Now, your book got very good reviews. The Irish Times thought it was wonderful. Were you surprised by that? And what's your next book about Murdoch on?
Well, yes. I mean, was I surprised? I think she said she didn't bother too much about critics, but who knows? You know, it's always nice to get some positive feedback. I suppose I was a bit surprised in that Murdoch herself wasn't that. Her novels was in something of an abeyance. You know, her novels haven't been so widely read in recent years as previously. So I was both surprised and delighted that it got quite a lot of notice and that the reviews were positive. So that's good. Will I write again? I think I might. I'm thinking of writing something maybe on her politics, because I think it's great that her sexual kind of pansexuality, as you suggested, her kind of recognition of different forms of sexuality and so on, is becoming fashionable in a sense. And certainly her novels are full of kind of emotional engagements, relationships and sexual encounters. And that, I think, is a big part of life. So it's great that it's there. But I think people probably underrate her political kind of dimension.
Is that just an idea at the moment, or have you actually mapped it out?
Just an idea. Yeah, just an idea. So but my ideas I usually follow through on them. So
very good. Now your other special subject is, of course, Robert Zimmerman, Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
Which, you know, a professor of politics writing about that. What do you make of the 17-minute new single, in inverted commas?
Yeah, well, I must admit, I've been interested in Dylan for a long time, and I edited a book on him about, 10 years ago. What do I mean, and I remember listening to him in 1963 and thinking, yes, this guy is actually just much more talented. His songs actually say more than most people. And I listened to Murder Most Foul, this new single, which came out in the height of this coronavirus scandal, crisis, and I thought, yes, this is good. I mean, it certainly hasn't got much of a tune. It's him reciting words and with some kind of piano and kind of violin in the background, but not really a tune. But it's interesting, and I think in recent years he's become more interested in exploring kind of memories and so on. And it looks like he's looking at the 1960s and like what happened. And the death of Kennedy figures large. And so Kennedy's a kind of ghost speaking to what comes afterwards. And I think Dylan, on the one hand, sees a kind of decline. I mean, I think he's a bit critical of Woodstock and Altamont and the Rolling Stones and the death there. The dream fades, as it were. But he's also puts in reference to lots of cultural and especially musical figures, which offer some relief, which offer some hope, I think, some expressive identity. And so, although the murder of Kennedy was an awful moment and one which blighted the politics of hope that the 1960s looked like it was representing, there is still a kind of connection and a kind of hope which comes through these musical and cultural forms. I mean, having said that, you know, he also does it in quite a good way, I think. So there we are.
Any parallels between him and Iris Murdoch?
Sorry?
Are there any parallels between him and Iris Murdoch?
Well, I think a parallel is that Dylan has many dimensions there. You know, he's got certainly an interest in sex, an interest in love, an interest in religion, an interest in politics. And he manages to do all this and express stuff in an engaging and kind of way. I think Dylan never does anything without kind of putting a lot into it, and he's his own man. And I think, and he can be fun as well as being dead serious. And I think Murdoch, I mean, I wouldn't want to say that she's simply serious. You can read some of those novels and they're funny, but she's got interest in religion, in politics, in love, in sexuality, and it all comes through in her writing. And she's her own woman. You know, she thinks it through hard and she expresses it well, just like Dylan does.
Both misunderstood geniuses, do you think, or not?
Well, I think they are slightly misunderstood because all of us are, you know, and they're massively in the public light, and so they will be misunderstood. I mean, on that, will they be misunderstood? I mean, A.M. Wilson wrote a rather, you know, scurrilous, a really tough kind of memoir of Iris Murdoch. It wasn't simply flattering. And it was subtitled As I Knew Her. And I listened to him give a talk not too long ago. And I said to him, well, do you think that works, that title, As I Knew Her? Because she's known in very different ways by lots of different people. And he did have the grace to say, yeah, if I wrote it again, I would say, As I Didn't Know Her. Iris Murdoch, As I Didn't Know Her. And it is true. I think who is really known, and they are, if you're in the public limelight, you get taken apart and you get misunderstood. But the point is to carry on, I suppose, and both of them have.
20 years from her death, how do you think Iris Murdoch is now seen?
Well, as I said, I think what's interesting is that philosophers are now really getting hold of her work, and a number of I think there are important studies which are going to come out. There's one study which is looking at Murdoch, that's developing Murdoch in relation to other women in Oxford in the post-war world, and that I think will be important. There are other explorations of her work in philosophy. So I think in philosophy, she will be increasingly well regarded. What I'm less certain of is whether the novels will come back. I think they will because they're good, and usually these things persist, good things persist. And I think there is a film in the offing of The Italian Girl, which I don't think is the best novel by Murdoch, but sometimes film directors can make a lot out of something. So if there's a successful film of The Italian Girl, if they make another film, then I think her novels might become more popular again. But I think she will persist because there is so much talent there. As I said, she takes these different dimensions of life and makes so much of them.
Okay, Gary, thank you very much. I'm sorry we couldn't see you, but we did hear you loud and clear. Next week, next Wednesday at 5 o'clock, there's a different format for this. We're going to have a virtual town hall with 4 councillors, Councillor Hollingsworth, Councillor Cook, the Liberal Democrat councillor to be, perhaps, for Jericho, and Councillor John Howson, and they'll be answering your questions. So please send me your questions. You all have my email address. That's perfectly that's well known out there. Let me have the questions for them. So it'll be a virtual town hall next week. The week after that, Professor Sir Richard Peto on the CV and facts and drugs, and one of the great epidemiologists of the world and one of Jericho's best known citizens, talking about the coronavirus epidemic. After that, I'm thinking of doing a little series called Just Imagine Jericho in 2025. If you've got any ideas on that, send them to me, because that's the whole point of this. But thank you all for watching or listening, and see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.